In the TNT, I talked about some of the background to RF exposure and where it came from and why we're stuck with it. I will go over again a little bit of what it's all about and why some of the funny things about it are that way. The reason why we have to do it is the National Environmental Protection Act of 1969, which required federal agencies to determine the environmental impact of whatever it is they were regulating. And it took the FCC until 1985 to even come out with anything like a proposed guidelines. You see, they were really enthusiastic about it. And it wasn't until the 1990s that they actually started doing work on and actually coming out with some sort of, it's not really regulations, but guidelines and requirements. They had a contract look at to a group to look at amateur radio stations in the early 1990s, and they came up to the conclusion that it was very difficult for an amateur radio station to actually exceed the exposure guidelines. So amateur radio wasn't exactly the primary driver as far as the FCC was concerned. In 1997, they came out with the set of guidelines for all radio stations of all kinds. And the requirements of that were basically to use calibrated field strength meters wandering around the area and determine where you were, what the flux, radio flux was in the area. And as I pointed out at the TNT, if that had stayed as being the only way to do it, the purpose of amateur radio clubs would be to provide the resources for all of us to be legal, because nobody would be able to, well, not nobody, but most hams would not be able to afford to have that kind of survey done. In 1997, they came out with the guidelines for amateur radio, which was put together with W5YI and the ARRL, and the purpose was to make it possible for amateur radio stations to do a RF exposure evaluation without costing an arm and a leg for either having to maintain your own calibrated equipment or to hire a consultant to go do it. And the result of that is sort of the Bible of this, which is OET Bulletin 65B, evaluating compliance with the FCC guidelines, additional information for amateur radio stations. And this is basically the only thing you need. It's available on the web. It's on the FCC website, and I will have the link for it at the end. The FCC has redone its website, I think, to make it look and feel like other government websites. The result is that they have a link to their old website so you can actually find things. But basically, this has everything in it you need to know, and it's really detailed, has some detailed information. And along with 65, which is the sort of general overview for all radio stations, the two of them together should give you a good idea of what you need to do. But it isn't as hard as you might think, and I'm going to show you just how easy it is to do an evaluation for most of us. And like I said, it's very difficult to exceed the requirements. So we're in pretty good shape. Why do we have to do it? Well, it's Part 97. Before causing or allowing an amateur radio station to transmit from any place where the operation could cause human exposure, the licensee is required to take certain actions. And one of them is you must perform a routine environmental evaluation. If the power of the station exceeds the limits given in the following table. This is the following table. So the first thing you see up here is if you're running under 500 watts, you don't have to worry about doing it at all for 40 meters and lower frequency or longer wavelength. If you've got a normal 100-watt rig, you don't have to worry about it on HF except for 12 and 10 meters. And most of our VHF and UHF rigs are under 50 watts, so we don't have to do it at all for a good part of our coverage. So basically, for a normal club member, maybe you have to do it for 10 and 12 meters. And notice again, it starts at 500 watts, it drops to a minimum around 10 meters and VHF, and then it starts going up again. And there's a reason for that. This is the specific absorption rate for a human body in RF. It's a combination of, it's a combination of water vapor and the fact how well of an antenna you make. So on the longer wavelengths, this is 30 megahertz here, 10 meters essentially. So as you start at very low frequencies and long wavelengths, you don't interact with the human body very well. It goes up as the wavelength starts reaching our height. This actually peak is at 78 megahertz, and then it starts dropping off again because the wavelength is less than the body. Also, water absorption is also in here too. This came from a lot of studies. There have been a lot more done. Now they're doing real sophisticated things, both in the lab with these gel body simulators with organs in them and everything, and also with computer modeling using wire mesh models and little organs inside. And it's held up. This dates from back in the early 90s, and this whole curve is held up pretty good. I must say, however, from my point of view, I wish there was a scale over here. I have no idea whether this is a log scale or a linear scale. But at any rate, this is why you have 500 watts in here, and then in this area it goes down to about 50 watts, and then it starts increasing again. So it's understandable. They did the best they could. However, even if you are under that evaluation, there's some caveats. If you have a multi-emitter location, such as an amateur repeater site or a multi-transmitter contest-style station, a more detailed analysis may be required. So, you know, your big gun DXers running the contest stations, you know, even if they're, well, most of them are running under 500 watts, but you have to do an evaluation. Mobile stations are categorically excluded. So you don't have to worry about your mobile operation at all, no matter what it is. It does say, however, you're required to comply with exposure guidelines. We'll get to that, what that means. But basically, in the case of a mobile station, only if you're, you know, at the Virginia QSO party and you're at a rare county and you're sitting there on with an, you know, running 100 watts from an antenna in the back for hours on end, then you have to worry about it. But a regular mobile station that's moving, no requirement to do any evaluation. There's another one here. Under some circumstances, such as an antenna that's located unusually near people, such as an indoor antenna or a balcony mounted antenna a foot or so away from a neighbor's balcony, you could be required to do an evaluation. So if you're running an antenna along the fence between you and your neighbor, you've got to be careful. This is the fundamental limit. This is what everything comes from. This is all radio stations of any kind are required to meet these requirements. Their power density here versus frequency band, Again, you see it starts it goes down and up, and just the way that we see. There are two areas or two different categories that you need to worry about. The first is the occupational controlled exposure, usually just called controlled. That's when the people in the area know they're in an RF field and they're aware of the hazards, and that's important. They're supposed to be aware of the hazards. The second one is the general population uncontrolled exposure, and that's for people who haven't a clue that you're transmitting and have no idea that radio waves might be going through their bodies and whether they're concerned about it or not. The interesting thing about this is not only the limits, which are more, they allow more exposure in the controlled area than they do in an uncontrolled area, but also the averaging time changes. This is how much you transmit in a given period of time, worst case. So for the controlled area, that's 6 minutes. For the uncontrolled area, it's 30 minutes. And that's an interesting difference, because it means, for example, and I'm going to do this, the VWS digital net might very well transmit for 6 solid minutes. And that in the controlled exposure, that's 100%. But in the uncontrolled exposure, 6 minutes is 1/5. So there's a difference there in the amount of averaging time that you need to worry about. So the maximum permitted exposure is in terms of average power. And that's average power at the antenna, which means you take out all the losses between your transmitter and the antenna. And then the duty cycle of the mode being used, and they have defined the duty cycle for different modes. CW is 40%, SSB is 20%, heavily compressed single sideband is 50%. So if you have your compression cranked up to the point you're distorting, you're also now worse than CW in terms of that duty cycle. And then, of course, FM, RIDI, digital, and AM are all 100% because the carrier's going the whole time. And then you have the duty cycle of the time of the transmissions, which is the worst case 6 minutes. We already covered that for the controlled area, and 30 minutes for the uncontrolled area. And so the power average is the power times the duty cycle for the mode and the duty cycle for the transmission. And if you do things right, you can get that average power down quite a bit without trying. So I'm going to do a couple of examples. Mostly the first two are to show you how easy it can be to do this and to not worry about it. You are not required to use any particular form or format. You are required to do it, and you're required to essentially have a record of it. But you can write on a sheet of paper, you can say 160 through 15 meters. I don't have to do it because I'm only running 100 watts. On 10 and 12 meters for 100% key down, my antenna's so far away I don't have a problem, or whatever. So there's no requirement to use any particular form or to do it in any particular way, but you can use, and I'll show you later, the FCC's worksheet. There's also an ARRL worksheet, and that sort of includes everything you can include in there for consideration. So the VWS digital net, the typical power at the antenna is about 30 watts. People run anywhere from 30 to 50 watts, but there's also losses in the antenna and everything else. So typically it's about 30 watts. The duty cycle for the mode is 100% because we're transmitting all the time. In 90 minutes, each station transmits 3 times. If we have 5 stations on the net, that's an average of 6 minutes per station every 30 minutes. So that means the worst case controlled is 6 minutes over 6 minutes, 100%. but the worst case uncontrolled is 6 minutes over 30 minutes, which is only 20%. So the average power for the controlled area is 30 watts, but the average power for the uncontrolled area is 6 watts. So, you know, the fact that the uncontrolled area has a lower threshold is counteracted by the fact that you're actually getting a big break on the average power that you're using. So, are we legal? Well, we need to know the antenna and the frequency. Most digital net members are using dipoles or worse. FCC, by the way, has definitions for a lot of things like verticals, ground plane verticals, Yagis, and things like that. And for the non-beam antennas, the dipole at 2.2 dBi is the highest gain antenna. And that's basically what most of the people on the net are using. If they're using a vertical, it's actually less than that. So this is worst case. I'm using an antenna height of 16 feet, and there's a reason for that. We put a standard 6-foot person underneath, and that means the closest you can get to if you walk under the antenna is 10 feet. As you'll see, that's not a very big problem. We use 7.0373 megahertz. We're going to ignore feed line losses. We're doing the worst case. Who cares? We're going to put 100 watts at the antenna and see what happens, 30 watts at the antenna and see what happens. I'm going to use the online calculator at hintlink.com power density to do the calculation. This is the web page. This has been in several different places. The FCC and some of the ARRL publications gives this at the University of Arkansas, I think. And it's not there anymore. No, University of Texas. And it's not there anymore. It's now at hintlink.com. So you fill it in. We fill in, I'm doing worst case, 30 watts into a dipole at 10 feet. Frequency is 7.1 megahertz. We're adding ground reflection because we're standing on the ground and the RF is coming down, bouncing off the ground and coming back. And the estimated power density is 0.1 milliwatts per centimeter squared. The maximum permissible exposure is 17.8 for the controlled environment and 3.57 for the uncontrolled environment. We're well below that. In fact, the distance for compliance to the antenna is less than a foot for the controlled environment and 1.8 feet for the uncontrolled environment. And that's at 30 watts. I didn't put in the 6 watts. 6 watts in the uncontrolled is going to make that even less. So basically, as long as you can stay 2 feet away from the antenna, you're compliant. Okay? That's one of the reasons why 40 meters you don't have to do it unless you're running 500 watts. Is that basically it's very difficult to not be in compliance. So these are you guys who have your antennas on the deck, on your deck, or Mel, didn't you have it on the ground at one point, or nearly on the ground?
It was 6 feet at one time.
6 feet, yeah. As long as you can stay, if you're inside your yard and nobody in the general public can get there, you only need to stay less than a foot away from it. So, not a big deal. And, you know, we only did one. We didn't need to do anything else. We didn't put in any of the other, factors. Just, hey, full power, let's see what happens. Do the same thing on the 10-meter net, which is on 10 meters, and therefore you have to do it if you're running if you're running more than 50 watts. Typical antennas are dipoles and verticals. The dipole, according to the FCC, and let's go with the FCC. It's justifiable. Dipole is the highest gain of an omnidirectional antenna, really, that they have. Power of 500 watts. I know some of the members on the net run more power to be able to get across from like Arlington or out in Centerville. Yep. And I'm using an antenna height of 25 feet with a standard person standing directly underneath it at 19 feet. I'm going to start with 100% duty cycles and no losses. Again, the worst, absolute worst case you can do. So we use 500 watts at on a dipole at 19 feet. Ground reflection again because we're sitting on the ground. And the answer comes out that we are in fact okay on a controlled environment but not on an uncontrolled environment. That means that if you know the person's transmitting and you're okay with that, you can stand right under the antenna. However, your neighbors have to be 28 feet away. Actually, it's also up in the air, so you got a triangle essentially that you're solving for, which I do here. And it turns out that it's about 22 feet from the sub-antenna point. So if you can keep your neighbors more than 22 feet away from your antenna, you're okay. No need to do anything else. But you can also figure in the duty cycle and say 20% for SSB, which is what the 10-meter net is, except on AM night. And you're talking, or you talk 6 minutes every 30 minutes, which are both 20%. Then the average power over 30 minutes is 100 watts. You can also, if you apply both of them, you get down to 20 watts. But I'm going to do a calculation with 100 watts, and the answer is you're compliant. And the distance is 12 feet. The antenna is 19 feet up. You're compliant.
So what
19 feet up.
mean in the shack?
What?
Okay, so you have, this is good for the antenna, but what about inside the shack where you have a
If you have a good feed line and good connectors, you should not have any RF in the shack. And a proper RF ground. Okay, and you can look. There's a guy K9YC, I think his call is, has a whole thing on how to do that correctly.
So if you have an let's say an MSJ field strength meter, right?
Uh-huh.
The thing with the two antennas.
Right.
How do you use that? How do you use
It has to be properly calibrated. That's why it's such a difficult thing to do. You have to have a calibration source and calibrate it against that calibration source. It has to be a certified calibration source.
Which also has to be calibrated for
Yes,
regularly.
it has to be calibrated by some,
When I first started, I had a long wire antenna,
Yeah.
which was basically antenna from the back of
Yeah,
my antenna
yeah,
tuner,
yeah.
and I had about 4 feet inside the shack.
Yep.
What was that? Is that why I'm bald now?
Could be. Could be. But if you could stay more than, well, in this particular case, 5 feet, then away from it, then you're fine. Yeah. But if you saw on the other one on 40 meters, it was less than a foot.
Right, right.
Okay.
Thank you.
So yeah, I mean, there's lots of little gotchas in here, but if you apply, I'm not even doing. I mean, we could get this down to 20 watts if you just don't transmit more than a few minutes.
Right, right.
The reason why I said 6 minutes every 30 is that we have 100% anyway with this particular setups for control. So, up beyond that, but you don't have to cut it shorter over the 6 minute period. So it depends upon how long-winded you are. Yeah.
So what to say about a 2-meter FM 60-watt mobile?
Mobile is you don't have to do.
No, I know you don't have to do it, but it's not
Still all right.
I'm talking about the people in the car.
Or next to the car.
Well, first of all, a car, except for the rear window, it depends upon where the antenna is located. Except for the windows, it's a Faraday cage.
Yeah, but it's going in the windows, right?
Yeah, it can come in the windows. The FCC says categorically that that a mobile station is unlikely to be used enough to exceed any of these requirements, even with 100 watts and an antenna in the back window. Okay, that's the FCC. That's not me. That's not making any kind of assumptions or anything else. It's what the regulation says. Mobile stations are categorically exempt.
Were they on drugs when they wrote that?
They what?
Were they on drugs when they wrote
No, they're trying to avoid problems.
No, I know it's trying
They're trying to make it easy, okay? They were on, back in the 1990s, they were on our side, okay?
Yeah, one thing I wanted to bring up also is that there's another factor, and that is the fact that a lot of the glass in cars may or may not have conduction in it, which means the glass itself is fairly lossy. So therefore, that's going to help you as well.
Yep.
Good point.
When I read that paragraph about mobile,
Uh-huh.
it looked like a non-proper noun, mobile. So does that mean it doesn't count unless the vehicle's moving?
No, it's a mobile installation.
I didn't say mobile installation.
It does in other
said
places. In 65, they go into great detail on what they mean by mobile. Okay? In the one for, I mean, that's true of everybody. It's true of you know, the old mobile telephones, systems, and police installations, all sorts of stuff like that. That's all considered under that. There's a whole section in 65 over what constitutes a mobile installation. But the typical amateur installation fits in that definition, and so they don't worry about it. Okay? But if you are, and they're more worried, the interesting thing is that they categorically state that they're more worried about passersby than people in the car. So,
Well, that's a matter of informed consent.
right. So if you're stopped for a long period of time and there are people around you, then you have to meet the requirements. But if you're not stopped for a long period of time, if it's incidental, then, and long period of time is, you know, 30 minutes. So
Or 6 minutes.
that's for inside the car. It's a 30-minute average for outside.
Wait a minute, you're talking about control though.
Uncontrolled. Uncontrolled. If people are standing around your car, that's an uncontrolled situation. That's average
So
over
their
30
exposure
minutes.
has to be less.
What?
Their exposure has to be less.
Be less, right. But you're averaging over 30 minutes. How long is your typical mobile, you know, how long are you going to sit there talking?
Depending on traffic. Depending
Yeah.
on traffic, of course, but that's another story.
John, yes.
Yeah, now, FCC aside, suppose I really want to, I really consider the people in my car. And my car, the Mini Cooper, has a glass roof,
Mm-hmm.
and the antenna is at the back of the car, but the car's very short.
Right.
And I know from trying to carry lumber in the car, the distance from my antenna to, say, the driver's head can't be more than like maybe 5 feet at
Right.
most.
First of all, they have tables for various whip antennas, quarter waves, 5/8 waves, things like that.
They do provide a method by which you can find
Yes.
out whether you're
Yes.
at risk.
They do not, however, cover shielding or absorption by things in the way. And they discuss that, and they say, well, a building could be as high as 10 to 20 dB, but they don't actually specify what you can use. All right.
Another thing to consider also with your mobile installations is the antenna pattern, because
Right.
you want to be radiating out.
Right.
If you have a higher gain antenna and you get that thing above your roof line, when you're down below that antenna, it is very difficult to exceed those
That's
volts.
right. That's exactly
Very
right.
difficult.
It's very difficult.
Unless it's attached to your bumper.
You know, that's a difference. But again, if you're HF, how big is that window open compared to the wavelength?
Well, unless you have
Okay.
a plastic Maserati or something.
And then you're going to have trouble mounting the antenna. Okay, so I'm going to do now the most involved one, which I am going to use the FCC worksheet. I'm going to do 1500 watt 3-element Yagi at 35 feet, fed by 85 feet at 9913. I know people who have are running 1500 watts are probably using hardline, but we're going to use 9913 because it's better for the example. We're going to use digital mode, but we're going to do it like a WSJT mode where it's 30 seconds on and 30 seconds off. I think they're mostly like 25 seconds on and 35 seconds off, but we'll use 30 seconds every minute. So it's 50% both controlled and uncontrolled. If you just keep going, running a WSJT mode continuously. And we're going to use, worst case will be 10 meters. This is the worksheet, and you fill it out, and it has 7 or 8 pages of instructions. But basically, I don't even fill in most of it for this. You put in the power, change that to dBW, you put the feed line. Feed loss comes from the ARRL table, and 10 meters at 9913 is about 0.75 per 100 feet. We're running 85 feet, so it comes out to 0.6375 dB loss. So the input to the antenna is 6.375 from 3176, which is 3112, and that's 1295, 1,295 watts. That's the power to the antenna. That's clearly over 50 watts. So this is the first page. You don't have to do the second page. The second page is repeaters. This is the third page. We have a 3-element tri-band Yagi, and actually the height above ground level, we said 35 feet, that's 10.7 meters. We're not actually going to use the gain, but this is the FCC's own definition of a tri-band Yagi. Use it. It's defensible. We're using digital, so the emission factor, type factor is 1. It's on all the time. The transmit duty cycle is 50%, 30 seconds on, 30 seconds off, 30 seconds on, 30 seconds off. So that's a 0.5. So we reduce that 1295 watts down to 648 watts. This is a table of 10 meter band, 3-element Yagi antenna at 29.7 megahertz at 9.1 meters. 9.1 meters is about 30 feet. So it's slightly lower than what we have. So that's good. It's going to be closer. We're going to assume a standard person. So it's 29 feet up. So if you're standing on the ground, 1.8 meters is your 6-foot standard person. And you notice that controlled, the distance is 0. You don't have to worry about control.
Of course, you don't want somebody grounding on your antenna.
What? If you can stand on the ground and reach an antenna that's 35 feet in the air, you can short it out. This is a height above ground of 9.1 meters, okay, 30 feet. In the uncontrolled area, at 500 watts it's 0, but at 750 it's 10.7. So, we got a 1 over r squared law. The distance, the actual distance that you need to stay away is the actual power over the table power by the square root and times the distance from the table. The table distance was 10.7 meters. We have 648 over 750. You go through the math, you get 9.94 meters as the distance, the compliance distance for uncontrolled. Unfortunately, if you're standing underneath the antenna, you're 8.9 meters. So while for the controlled area, you're compliant, for the uncontrolled area, you're not. Because it's 0 for that. So what does that mean? Here's the whole sheet. Well, The closest point is a 6'12" person at the base of the tower. That's 8.9 meters. We already went through all of this. The compliance, it's not compliant. You need to keep the public 33 feet from the end of the antenna. The FCC says from any part of the antenna. They don't say from the center of the radiating or anything else. They say any part of the antenna. I looked up a couple of tri-band Yagis, and the booms are typically about 16 feet, so half a boom is about 8 feet or 2.4 meters. You solve this triangle, this side has to be 10 meters. This side's, whatever it was, 8.9 meters. We have an 8-foot or 2.4 meter here. You solve for X, you get 4.5 meters, you add 4.5 and 2.4, you get 7 meters, or about 23 feet. So you have to keep the public 23 feet away from the base of your tower. That doesn't seem to be too hard. I think most lots that would have a tower on it probably has 23 feet between it and the property line. But suppose the neighbor has a 2-story house. The second floor is about 12 feet. You got a standard person at 6 foot, so you get about 5.5 meters up. Go back to our table. We have 3.7 and 6.1. We'll use 6.1 because it's higher. Notice that it drops off at 9.1. Why does it do that? Ground reflection. You're starting to get high enough, the ground reflection is less of a contributor. So, once again, we actually now have a control area distance of 4.6 meters and an uncontrolled at 750 watts of 21.6. We do our little calculation. Remember it was 0.93. So it's 4.25 meters for the controlled and 20.1 meters for the uncontrolled. I don't remember whether I went on. Yeah, so 14 feet. The tower, however, is at 5.5 meters. So you take 5.5 from 10.4, you get 5.2 meters. So the controlled area is okay, even if the tower is attached to the house, because it's longer than the necessary distance from you to the antenna. Even if you used the raw number, it still comes out being okay. Uncontrolled distance, however, is 66 feet. Does anybody remember what, I mean, it's 20 meters, right? What's 66 feet? 40 meter dipole, yeah. So you got to keep them a 40 meter dipole away. And you don't get a slope out of this, too much of a slope out of this, because your neighbor's house is sitting up at the antenna height, a little below the antenna height. So, and you have an 8-foot boom, so they have to be 74 feet from the tower. I think I can do that. I'm not sure if everybody can. So what do we do about that? You can reduce the transmitter time over 30 minutes. That, if you get it down low enough, you'll be okay. You can reduce power under 1,500 watts. Or don't point the beam at the neighbors.
Put the beam higher.
You can do that too. You can do that too. There's lots of things you can do. There's lots of ways out of this. We're doing this 50%, which is heavily compressed SSB or digital running 30 seconds on, 30 seconds off. If you don't operate that way, if you operate SSB only, then you've cut this by more than half, and that's the square. That's times 0.7. So is that right? Yeah. So that's what, 49 feet or something like that? I got that right? 50 feet? About 50 feet. So you can cut that down just by using a different mode. Or not talking 50% of the time. Over 30 minutes. Because this is uncontrolled. So there's ways around almost any problem if you cook the numbers. This is the conclusions from the FCC form. I checked fences, lock gates, or doors to prevent persons who are unaware of the probability of RF exposure. because I have a fence. Now, there are some potential problems. There's no information on attenuation by buildings and shielding. You're sort of stuck. You can't claim that there's a metal shed between you and a neighbor, and therefore nothing gets there. And there's no tables for antennas not in common use, such as random wires, inverted V's, lazy H's, etc. So what do you do? Well, the ARRL has an exposure book here, thanks to Pete for doing that. It has some more antenna tables, including G5RVs, inverted V's, and not too much else, but lots and lots of different cases, including different heights than what we had, than what the FCC provides. So you can buy the book and use the tables in there. You can use published gain and calculators and use in beam. So you know your antenna has a certain gain in a certain beam, and you just say, okay, if I'm in that beam, what's the limit, and in worst case, and then decide whether that works or not. The FCC actually encourages the use of antenna models, and my favorite, if I can find it, I may have not brought it, oh yeah I did, W4RNL. LD did about every kind of antenna that a ham has ever used. And some bogus antennas that were foisted on hams by commercial firms. And you can go, it's available on, his website is available on antennix.com. You have to sign up for it. It's free. And you can go through his models, or you can get his little CD. You can get the CD from AntennaX that has his entire webpage on it. He's a silent key. He's a silent key in 2008 or 2007.
Who's keeping his site up?
What?
Who's keeping his site up?
AntennaX.
Oh.
AntennaX is an online antenna magazine. Okay. There's a free section, but if you want all of it, you have to subscribe to it and pay and all that sort of stuff. But the W4RNN models are free. You just have to, what happened was after LB died, people started logging on and trying to download the entire website. That crashed AntennaX's servers. They also made them very upset, so they shut down the site and then brought it up with a password and other safeguards to prevent you from, you only get a certain amount of download at one time.
Just throttle it.
Throttling it, yeah. But it's great. There's everything in there. There's lazy H's, there's inverted V's, there's extended double ZEPs, there are all sorts of antennas. You name it, he's probably modeled. So you use his models. You can make your own model using antenna modeling software, but you better know what you're doing. And then you can use the calculators, you know, essentially like ray tracing. You figure out the gain in a certain direction and then use the calculators to figure out whether you're okay. And you can also use, if you really want to, you can use the FCC's formula, which is what the calculators use, and make your own version. Or you can use an antenna with more gain and adjust by the gain differences, but remember the inverse square law. That is, if you, like for example, if you choose an antenna that has twice the gain as yours, you only get the square root of 2 decrease in the distance, not half. So that's the different techniques you can use. Here's the resources. The radio frequency safety has all sorts of FCC proclamations on how safe RF is. The OAT bulletins --line, not online, just line. That's where all the bulletins are. Everybody should have 65B. And by the way, the ARRL book has 65B in it as part of it. The power density equation that you, website that your web form that I used is at hintlink.com power density. Antennex has W4RNL's models, and the AWRL has an RF exposure section. That's it.